Sauergut literally translates to sour wort. It can be added to adjust mash pH or used post-boil. And Brülosophy contributor Jordan Folks swears by it when making European lagers. He's going to show us his process, and we've got data from 2 Sauergut-powered experiments. Should you be reaching for the sour wort on your next brew day? Let's find out. This episode is sponsored by Yakima Valley Hops. More on them in a bit. Okay, Jordan, first question. Am I saying this right? Sauergut? Sauergut? How do I say it?
I think that's probably about right.
What is it? I mean, I've said it's sour wort, but what does that mean? What is it?
Right. So Sauergut is a Reinheitsgebot compliant way to adjust your pH. So it's commonly used in the mash, and it's soured wort, right? And so it's basically a sour mash wort. So the simplest way you could make it at home is take some simple, DME, 1040 kind of starter wort. You could also use like a real mash, maybe draw off your wort from like a larger brew day. And then you're just going to throw in a handful of uncrushed Pilsner grains, hold that at like 120 Fahrenheit. You want to keep all oxygen out, and then it's going to self-acidify. And so you're going to add that to your mash for your pH reduction. And it's a way to, naturally, without the use of, foreign chemicals, reduce your mash pH and arguably add a really interesting flavor component that some say is really part of that missing link to make a truly authentic tasting German lager.
Well, interesting, and we'll get to that. So I can use this effectively in place of my little bottle of lactic acid, right? Where I'm typically adjusting my mash pH that way by just adding that into the water. I can use the Sauergut instead to perform the same task.
Exactly. We have a lot of different acids that are disposable. We have, the lactic acid, phosphoric acid, citric acid, and Sauergut is yet another one we can use. However, in Germany, you're not allowed to add these exogenous chemicals like a phosphoric acid. And so they're forced to make their own using beer ingredients. And it really has a very interesting flavor component that I really find that I enjoy in the lager type of beer.
With the flavor component specifically in mind, when can I use this in brewing? Is it just something to adjust my water before I mash in?
Yeah, you can use it in your mash, so you can add it to your strike water. I will maybe just add it like when I'm stirring in my grains. And then you can also use it for a post-boil adjustment. That's one thing that we might want to think about is the pH of our fermentation. And a lot of, different brewers of even IPA brewers, German lager brewers, they're reducing that pH going into the fermenter to expedite, the fermentation, kind of time phase, right? Because that yeast is going to decrease the pH of your wort or beer. But why don't we expedite that? And then maybe we could like shave some time off of the fermentation process, maybe have a more vigorous and high quality fermentation. And this is just yet another time we can add Sauergut into the process and in theory adding more of that good Sauergut flavor as well.
Now, Jordan, I know 2 things about you. One, you have a giant packet of Sauergut on your shelf at home. And 2, you use it a lot, particularly when brewing German lagers. So I would love to hear about your end-to-end process of how do I actually use this? How do I incorporate it into a brew day?
Sure. Well, really, you use it just like you would any other acid product. I'm using a product from Weyermann. They only sell at the professional level. So what me and my friends did is we went to our local homebrew store, Eppich Steinbart, and they were able to acquire it through their, channels, and then we split it up amongst ourselves. So the box is pretty big. I think it's a kilogram. And so it's like a lifetime supply for a normal home brewer. So definitely want to find some friends to split it up with. A pro brewery that's lager focused, they might use it. So you might be able to give them to pour you off a little bit or maybe acquire a box for you. So one thing that's really important to understand is the concentration. So lactic acid typically comes in 88% acid concentration. The Weyermann product is 5.5%. So what that means in a 5-gallon batch, instead of like 4 milliliters of lactic acid, you might use up to like 100 milliliters of the Sauergut because of its comparatively lower strength. So in the Brewfather application, which you and I use, you can change the acid concentration of your acid adjustment. And then that way you can really dial in just how much Sauergut you need to add to your mash. So I will use the Brewfather app to tell me how much Sauergut I need to add given a 5.5% starting concentration to achieve a mash pH of typically about 5.4. And then following the boil, just as like a rough rule of thumb, I'll do about 2/3 of that as my post-boil addition. And I find that that is really good at predicting a approximately a 5.1 to 5.0 post-knockout pH, which is really where you want to be targeting when doing those post-boil adjustments. I will caveat that if you make your own at home, it might not be as strong, and it's really hard at the homebrew level to measure the actual acid concentration. So you might be using quite a bit because the Wireman product is, you know, distilled or concentrated down to like a thick molasses type, flowable goo. Whereas if you make it at home, it's going to be, as thin as beer or wort. So you're going to use quite a bit at the home scale. Definitely would recommend a pH meter and maybe start with like a liter in your mash edition as a starting point. Measure that pH at room temp and just go from there.
Where would you use it? In what sort of beer styles would you find yourself reaching for the Sauergut?
Yeah, I would say really any European style, at the very least, Czech, Belgian, and German styles. I find it works well. So any type of European lager. I think you can also use an American lagers as well. I've used it in saison to great success. I would not be using it in IPA or some sort of American style that you don't want this kind of just characteristic German flavor into it. A lot of German breweries are using this, maybe all of them, and it really does have this kind of thing that just that's German, and it really is this kind of mental association with the flavor that it provides. Some people say, grape nuts or grape or even grape Kool-Aid is this type of flavor it provides. It's kind of hard to put your finger on it, but it definitely tastes German. And so I would veer away from adding it to things that you don't think that that type of flavor profile is going to meld well with.
Liquid Germany, I like it. Okay, well, this being Brülosophy, we have, of course, put Sauergut to the test with a couple of experiments. Before we get to those, though, a quick word about today's sponsor, and that's Yakima Valley Hops. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world. I'm using Yakima Valley hops in every batch I brew, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, and many more. Homebrewers can select specific crop years, and most hops come in 2, 8, and 16 ounce packages. I like particularly the 8-ounce bags, which I can keep in my freezer for leftovers. Head over to yakimavalleyhops.com to see everything they have to offer. Now, let's get to the experiments, and we're going to start with one by Cade Job.
Right. So it's kind of a funny background story in this. I recall I was skiing alone one day and I was listening to the Brülosophy podcast, and Cade was the co-host, and he was naming off all the different types of acids that one could use on a brew day to adjust their mash pH. And I was like, there's one glaring omission, Sauergut. So this was before I was on the brew crew, and he lives in my same state. So I reached out and I was like, there, you missed one. It's called Sauergut, and I have a whole box from Wireman. So if you'd like, if we can link up, I can give you some, and you can actually test out, does this taste any different?
Right. Now, the purpose of this, and I love that story. I love the fact that you're just mind your own business skiing and like, Sauergut. We need Sauergut. So the purpose here was to evaluate the differences between a Kolsch where the mash pH was reduced using either Sauergut or using lactic acid. So the way that he went about this was as the mash water was heating up, he measured out 180 milliliters of Sauergut and 9.5 milliliters of 88% lactic acid, which he expected would give the same mash pH. So that comes down to, Jordan, what you were saying of you'll need to use a calculator here to figure out how much to add because there is such a difference here. And when Cade added these, performed his mash, he then took a pH reading, and he saw that basically he had got it right, that the Sauergut was at 5.42 pH and the lactic acid was at 5.4 pH. So from there, he went through, completed his brew day. When the beer was finished, the final gravity, there was a slight difference. So the Sauergut was at 1010 final gravity. The lactic acid was at 1008. Jordan, do you think we should read anything into that?
I think it's hard to say. It is possible, but it's just really hard to say if that's really a function of the acid type or not.
Right. And when Cade poured these beers out ready for evaluation, they looked the same, at least visually. So there was that. Now, were these actually distinguishable by tasters? Well, a total of 21 people participated in our experiment. Each participant was served two samples of the beer made with Sauergut and one sample of the beer made with lactic acid and asked to pick out the odd beer out. At this sample size, we needed 12 tasters to identify the unique sample to reach statistical significance, which is exactly the number that did, indicating participants were able to reliably distinguish the beers. So you were right on there with giving Cade that because we ended up with with a significant result.
And Cade has really prided himself on his Kolsch recipe and progress in crafting the style. And he told me that he could easily tell the difference, and his preference was resounding for the Sauergut version. And he said that this is really like what his Kolsch had been missing, and it really helped him make a truly authentic example.
What about everybody else? A total of 4 tasters reported preferring the Sauergut beer, but 8 said they liked the one with lactic acid more, which just goes to show the preference question, well, it's subjective, right? Who knows which is, there is no right answer. But in this case, actually, more people preferred the lactic acid than the Sauergut version.
I'm actually not terribly surprised by that because there's not a ton of commercial American brewers, let alone home brewers, using this product. And it really does have an interesting, unique flavor. And if your baseline reference is American Kolsch style ale, this might taste a little weird. I'm assuming that those that tried the Sourgut one didn't spit it out, but I could see how it would be just a little different than what they were used to.
Yeah. So people may perhaps were going for the one that's more familiar to them rather than necessarily the one that they would have enjoyed more if they kind of got used to it. Interesting. Okay. So Sauergut is different to lactic acid and it results in a beer that is perceptively different. We wanted to then test something else, which in this case was the impact of post-boil acidification with Sauergut on a German Pilsner. This was your one, Jordan. So tell me, what was the thinking behind this experiment?
Right. So we had demonstrated in Cade's experiment that sour gut does have a perceptible impact, presumably on the actual flavor and organoleptic properties of the beer. But what I was kind of curious is there's any sort of difference in terms of its effect on the post boil acidification. Does that reduction in that pH going into the fermentation actually make it taste more German or just better? And so I wanted to keep, it was kind of challenging thinking through how I control for the confounds here. And so, given that we've already demonstrated that sour gut probably has some sort of flavor impact, what if we keep that constant between the two mashes? Let's actually acidify both mashes with the sour gut, but then we'll only add sour gut post boil to one of them to see if that is increasing the sour gut intensity of the finished beer, and then maybe some ancillary fermentation benefits or something like that.
Right. So both beers started with Sauergut for the mash pH adjustment. And at that point, we split the variable comes into play after the boil. So you're able to do a complete identical brew day right up until it's time to put those beers in their fermentation vessels. So into one of the batches, you added enough Sauergut to acidify one of the batches to 5.1 pH. So now we have a situation where we do have different levels of acidity going into fermentation. So what is the impact you would expect to see from that?
I would expect that there might be some observable impact related to like attenuation, speed, and rigor. So maybe you might see a faster, terminal gravity with the one that's acidified, as well as perhaps even a lower finishing gravity when you do your final gravity readings. But what I was really curious to know is, does it taste more sour gutty?
Indeed. Now, you did track the pH throughout this entire process, so we could keep an eye on that. So, as we said, the Sauergut batch was down to 5.12 pH. The one that was not adjusted was at 5.39 going into fermentation. At the end of fermentation, you took another measurement, and now the Sauergut was at 4.35 pH. The batch with no acidification was closer now. It's at 4.44 pH, but it's still not quite the same. It didn't quite catch up.
Right. And so I find that pretty fascinating that, yeast on its own is able to do a fairly aggressive job of pH reduction, but we're getting just a little bit more acidic of a product when we reduce that pH at knockout.
Right now, is any of this detectable? So, in this experiment, a total of 20 people participated in this experiment where they received one sample of the beer that was acidified with Sauergut post boil, and then two samples of the beer that were not acidified, and asked to pick out the odd one out. Of the 20, we needed 11 tasters to reach statistical significance. Only 8 did. This was not a statistically significant result. Did this surprise you, Jordan?
It did, in part because my very first experiment for the website was testing the effect of post-boil acidification on IPA, and I and tasters could really reliably taste a difference. And, we often will reduce our pH in a IPA fermentation because of the to kind of counteracting the inevitable rise in pH associated with aggressive dry hopping, but there were no dry hops present here whatsoever. And so my thought is that there was something more than just dry hop pH creep, mitigation. But at the end of the day, I couldn't really taste the difference either, and I was pretty shocked that it not only did the fermentation, pH character not really make a fundamentally different tasting product, but it didn't exactly, take the sour gut flavor character to 11. They were pretty similar.
Yeah, right. So you were saying that you were unable to distinguish them yourself, which I did find surprising. But to your mind, there were Sauergut used in both of these batches from the start. So did you feel like you were still picking up on that kind of the taste of Germany in both of those batches?
Totally. And so I think that if you have enough laying around, it's, a nice little piece of insurance. Maybe you're going to get better fermentation kinetics or something. But as long as you're adding it at some point in the process, I think that we're effectively, injecting that taste of Germany into your beer.
Anybody who's watching this who is maybe never tried Sauergut and wants to give it a go themselves, they should contact you, right, Jordan? You have a little bit to spare?
I actually do. It's going to last me forever.
Well, Jordan, thank you. This was fascinating to hear about this and to see your process for using it. And it is something I think many people are going to at least want to try now to just see what that flavor compound it adds to these beers, particularly if you're working on a German lager. Another important thing to do if you're working on a German lager is to make sure you have enough yeast. Jordan has a fantastic process for creating and harvesting yeast. You can learn all about that in this video here.